All right, so in this lecture, we're going to start talking about biochemistry, which is the chemistry of living things. So, for starters, the compounds that we're going to be talking about are what are called organic compounds. Now, the term organic translates to being from life, which is where they get the name for organic foods and things like that in your grocery store, like, oh, I only buy organic green beans. That's not what it means. The meaning of organic is not the same in chemistry as it is in your grocery store. So they're using it to mean like all natural, they didn't use any pesticides on it, etc. When we use the word organic in chemistry, even though the word comes from, the origin is from life, because we used to think that these organic compounds were only made by living things. But what makes something organic in our class is going to be the presence of carbon. So that's going to be important. Make sure you know that carbon is the element that makes something organic. So what we're going to see are these single pieces, and they're not just carbon, they're carbon and some other things. And they're going to be called monomers. They're going to be our building blocks. And they're going to form these larger molecules called polymers. So mono means one. Poly means many. And so we're building these lengthy chains of monomers into polymers. We also sometimes call these macromolecules. And the focus of our chapter is going to be on four main macromolecules. So these are the four. So carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So today, we're specifically going to talk about carbohydrates. So carbohydrates, one thing that is very specific that would help you to identify, say on a test, a carbohydrate, is that they only contain three elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and they're in a very specific ratio, 1 to 2 to 1. Sort of like, another way this could be written would be CH2O parentheses N. So sort of like in math, if N, say, was 3, then I would multiply 3 times each of these, and I would get C3H6O3. And the reason I draw it this way is because the origin of the word carbohydrate, it actually means carbon water. And if you look at this base formula, it's carbon and water, but then some number of those. And so notice the ratio, C2H4O2, C3H6O3. Notice how it's always, for every one carbon, 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. And the main thing we use these for, although there's a few other things, but the main thing is this is our main energy source, carbohydrates. Another thing that they do is they form structures. For example, the cell walls of plants. Plant cells have cell walls around them, and those are made out of carbohydrates. Funguses also have cell walls made out of carbohydrates. So the building blocks of carbohydrates are monosaccharides, and this translates, remember, mono means one, and saccharide basically just means sugar. So these are going to be made out of single sugar molecules, or simple sugar molecules. And complex carbohydrates are polymers, chains of monosaccharides. In fact, they are called polysaccharides for many sugars. And an example of a polysaccharide, which we're going to cover in a second, would be starch. An example of a monosaccharide, and again, we're going to talk about this on the next slide, would be glucose. So if we take a look, here's an example. This is one glucose molecule. So this is a monosaccharide, a simple sugar. And if you were to count up the carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, you would see that its formula is C6, 6 carbons, H12, 12 hydrogens, O6. And you see that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio in a glucose. Now, this is a shorthand way of drawing it. Notice how they left off all the letters, all the elements, but they're still there. This is just kind of a shorthand drawing. And see what happens in the starch? It's a chain of glucose molecules that are chemically hooked together. So that's a complex carbohydrate, whereas glucose is a simple sugar or a simple carbohydrate. So what do we do in our bodies to store our glucose? So glucose we have floating around in our blood. This is what our cells use for what we call cell respiration to make ATP, energy. We use glucose. But if we eat more glucose than we need, what happens to it? Well, it basically goes to our liver, one of our organs, and it gets stored there as a polysaccharide called glycogen. So those glucose molecules, they basically get hooked together in a chain, and then your liver just sort of holds on to them. And then at some point later, when you need that energy, like between lunch and dinner and you haven't eaten anything, your cells are starting to get hungry, and they're like, oh, we need glucose. Your liver, signals will go to your liver, and it'll just start breaking these pieces of glucose off, and then they can go to your cells and be broken down for energy. And that's what this explains, that when your glucose gets low, because you're using it as an energy source, we break down the glycogen in our liver, and we use that for energy. Now, technically, if we eat too much sugar, we actually don't store all of it as glycogen. What would actually happen is ultimately you could convert some of it to fat. So if you eat too much sugar consistently, if you're eating way too many calories in a day, you would eventually store the remainder of it as fat. But glycogen is how we get from meal to meal and keep our blood sugar and the sugar, the flow of sugar to our cells for energy, how we keep that stable. It's what keeps us alive overnight while we're sleeping. We're not eating when we sleep, so where's our body getting its energy? Oh, it's breaking down the glycogen that was stored up after the last meal that we ate. Now, plants do not store their energy the same way we do. It turns out they instead store their energy as starch, which, if you looked at its chemical structure, looks very similar to glycogen, but it's not exactly the same. In fact, and this is not on your test, but glycogen and starch are actually what are called isomers of each other. An isomer is a molecule that has the same formula, but it has a different structural arrangement. Just like if I gave you 10 Legos and I said build something, everybody might build something that looked different, but technically it was the same 10 Legos you started with. Same thing here. So starch is an isomer of glycogen. It has the same formula, the same number of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygens, but they're arranged in a different way. It's just the way plants are. They have different enzymes than we do that build slightly different molecules to store their energy. But we can eat starch and break it down. This is what we get from potatoes and rice and pasta and wheat and bread. That's starch. And then we break it down from starch back into its monosaccharides, which is glucose. And then if we don't need all that glucose, we can then turn around and store it as glycogen. So you can see there's a cycle here. Cellulose is a slightly different isomer. It is what gives cell walls their strength. So this is showing a plant cell of a particular plant, and around it is this cell wall made out of glycogen. We actually cannot digest glycogen. In our bodies, it's like fiber. It's what just sort of passes through us and keeps us regular, but we can't actually extract calories from glycogen. All right, and actually that's where we're going to stop for this lecture, and then next time we're going to jump into our next category, which is lipids.